There wasn't one single moment when Hitler's top generals realized they were going to lose the war. No sudden flash of truth, no single battle that made everything crumble. It came slowly, like a chill creeping under a locked door, a feeling that began as a whisper and turned into a suffocating certainty. It began long before the final shots were fired. At first, they believed they were invincible. The German war machine was a storm that swept across Europe, swift, ruthless, unstoppable. Paris fell in weeks. Poland was crushed in days. Every victory fed the myth of their own genius. Hitler's confidence infected the room like a fever. His generals clicked their heels, saluted, and believed they were rewriting history. To them, defeat wasn't just impossible, it was unthinkable. But behind the speeches and the parades, cracks were forming. As early as 1941, when German tanks stalled in the frozen outskirts of Moscow, the first tremors of doubt began. The winter was merciless. Engines froze, men starved. The quick victory they had been promised turned into a nightmare of mud, blood, and endless retreat. In the icy silence of the Russian front, whispers began to replace certainty. By 1942, even the most loyal officers could see the cracks spreading through the empire. Hitler's decisions were growing erratic. He no longer listened to his generals, he lectured them. Every failed offensive became someone else's fault. Entire divisions were ordered to hold positions long after logic said retreat. To disobey was treason, to obey was suicide. Maps that once told stories of conquest now told stories of collapse. Red arrows that once pushed forward now curved backward, encircling the Reich. Supplies ran low. Trains that once carried victory banners now carried the wounded and the dead. Oil, the lifeblood of the war machine, was running out. Without it, even the mighty panzers became useless steel shells rusting in the snow. Still, the illusion of strength had to be maintained. Propaganda posters declared victory as certain. Speeches spoke of final triumphs. But the men in the war rooms, the ones who saw the reports, who watched the numbers turn against them, knew the truth. They still stood tall in public, clicking their heels, saluting with practiced precision. But in private, they were haunted. The turning point came not in a single battle, but in a growing sense of inevitability. Stalingrad, Kursk, North Africa, Sicily, each defeat tore another piece from the myth of German invincibility. When Field Marshal Paulus surrendered at Stalingrad in early 1943, the shock was seismic. Over 90,000 German soldiers marched into Soviet captivity, and only a fraction would ever return. For the first time, the generals saw what Hitler refused to admit. Germany was fighting a war it could no longer win. By 1944, the nightmare was undeniable. The Allies had landed in Normandy. The Soviets were pushing west with unstoppable force. German cities burned nightly under Allied bombs. Hitler still raged from his bunker, demanding counterattacks that could no longer be launched. His generals stood before him, nodding, pretending to believe, even as they knew the truth. The Reich was finished. In the summer of 1941, the German army, the Wehrmacht, was at the peak of its power. In less than 2 years, Hitler's armies had crushed Poland in 27 days, France in 46, and Yugoslavia in just 12. They had taken Norway, the Netherlands, and Belgium with a speed that shocked the world. For the generals, the formula seemed simple. Speed plus power equals victory. They felt proven right. Their blitzkrieg, or lightning war, had worked. When they launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, on June 22nd, they believed it was their final, greatest triumph. German panzers, or tanks, rolled across the vast plains of the Soviet Union. They advanced hundreds of kilometers in just a few weeks, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. By the fall, many officers believed the war would soon be over. Hitler's dream of destroying the Soviet Union in one quick campaign felt like it was about to come true. But underneath all the confidence, a quiet worry began to grow. Some of the older officers who had fought in World War I saw a dangerous pattern emerging. The front was too big, the supply lines were too long, and they were stretching thinner with every mile they advanced. General Heinz Guderian, a key figure in tank warfare, wrote in his diary that with winter coming, his men were still in summer boots, and their supplies were 700 kilometers behind them. His fast-moving tanks often outran their fuel trucks, leaving them stranded for days. The infantry was weeks behind. But in Berlin, Hitler, who believed he was never wrong, demanded they push even deeper into Russia. By November 1941, as the first snow fell, that worry turned into real dread. The Soviet Union had not collapsed as Hitler had predicted. New Soviet armies, seemingly appearing from nowhere, counterattacked fiercely outside Moscow. The temperatures dropped, German equipment failed, and for the first time, the unstoppable German army was stopped. By then, over 130,000 cases of frostbite had been reported among German soldiers. That winter, the first serious doubts took hold. The chief of the Army General Staff, Franz Halder, wrote that if Moscow didn't fall before the snow, the whole war in the East would become a marathon they had never prepared for. This was a quiet admission that the plan was broken. The generals had planned for a short, fast war, not a slow, grinding one. They were running out of supplies, men, and hope. Some started to whisper that the war was already impossible to win. Publicly, they still promised victory, but privately, they started talking about an Endkrieg, a war without an end. After the winter of 1941, they knew Germany was stuck in a war of exhaustion against an enemy they had completely underestimated. A year later, things only got worse. In the spring of 1942, Hitler demanded a new offensive to get the momentum back. The generals followed orders, but their confidence was fake, hiding deep worries. The new plan was Case Blue, a risky drive to capture the oil fields in the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad. The plan stretched the army's resources to the breaking point. Field Marshal von Bock warned that splitting their forces was a huge risk, but Hitler dismissed him, saying, "You always see black clouds," and fired him. As the tanks moved south, many officers knew the plan was a mistake. The distances were huge, and the supply lines were about to snap. By the fall, the German Sixth Army was stuck in a brutal street-by-street fight in Stalingrad. Then the Soviets struck. On November 19, 1942, they launched Operation Uranus, a massive counterattack. In just a few days, they had surrounded 250,000 German soldiers in a freezing, empty wasteland. The commander, General Friedrich Paulus, radioed for help, saying his troops were exhausted and had eaten their horses. Hitler's only reply was, "Hold to the last man." On January 31, 1943, with his men starving and frozen, Paulus surrendered, disobeying Hitler's direct order. The defeat was a massive psychological blow. Stalingrad destroyed the idea that the German army was invincible. In Germany, the Chief of Staff, General Kurt Seitzler, was so furious and devastated that he reportedly threw his medals in the trash. From then on, the officers at the High Command stopped planning attacks. They only looked for escape routes. The government called it a heroic sacrifice, but the generals knew the truth. They had just lost an entire army and any chance of winning on the Eastern Front. A terrifying question began to spread through the officer corps. If this could happen to their best army, what hope was left? For many generals, the defeat at Stalingrad was the moment they knew the war was lost. The year after Stalingrad shattered any hope that was left. Desperate to win back control, the Germans planned a huge attack at Kursk in July 1943. They gathered 2,700 tanks, the largest tank force in history, to attack the strongest defensive line ever built. Many generals knew it was a bad idea. They had intelligence that the Soviets were ready and waiting. The element of surprise was gone, but Hitler insisted. The Battle of Kursk was Germany's last big gamble in the East, and it failed completely. The Red Army's defenses were too strong, and the German tank divisions were destroyed. From that point on, as Colonel General Erhard Raus later said, they were only fighting to delay the end. After Kursk, even the most loyal officers felt a sense of doom that filled every meeting. Hitler kept talking about miracle weapons, but the generals looking at the maps knew better. The Red Army was pushing west, and they knew the Allies would soon open a second front in Western Europe. At the same time, Allied bombers were destroying Germany from the air. In 1 week, an attack on Hamburg called Operation Gomorrah killed an estimated 34,000 civilians and left 1 million homeless. General Guderian wrote to his wife, "The homeland burns, and I can only watch the ashes." German factories couldn't replace the tanks and planes they were losing. The U-boats were being destroyed in the Atlantic, cutting off supplies. The defeats kept coming. In January 1944, the Soviets broke the 900-day siege of Leningrad. In March, they entered Romania, cutting off Germany's main oil supply. In May, Allied troops landed in Italy. Germany was shrinking from all sides. The arrogance of the early war years was replaced by a sense of doom. Even loyal generals like Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel were heard saying they needed a miracle. They were no longer fighting for victory, but just to survive. The second front they had all been dreading finally opened on June 6, 1944. D-Day. When the invasion began, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the commander of the German forces in the area, was in Germany for his wife's birthday. He rushed back to France, but it was already too late. Allied troops were pouring onto the beaches. Rommel's chief of staff, General Hans Speidel, called Berlin and said, "If we do not throw them into the sea within 48 hours, the Atlantic Wall would be nothing but a memory." They couldn't throw them back. Within weeks, the Allies had more men and machines in France than the Germans had in the entire area. German forces were held back by Hitler's constant meddling, as he refused to let them move their tank reserves without his personal permission. General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, a panzer commander, summed up their desperation. "We are fighting a mechanized war with horse-drawn logistics." The enemy had all the advantages, and every general knew it. Field Marshal Rommel saw the situation clearly and told his staff the war was hopeless. He believed the Allies' superior resources made victory impossible and argued that continuing to fight was a crime. He secretly urged Hitler to make peace with the Western Allies to save Germany from being completely destroyed. Hitler, however, was furious and refused to listen. The D-Day invasion and the massive Allied force pouring into France made it clear to the generals that Germany was now caught in a two-front war it could not possibly win. By the middle of 1944, many officers no longer believed in Hitler. They saw him as a leader who was driving Germany into total destruction. A group of high-ranking officers, including Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, decided that killing Hitler was the only way to save the country. They weren't just angry about Nazi crimes, they were professional soldiers who believed they had to act. On July 20, 1944, Stauffenberg planted a bomb in a briefcase next to Hitler during a meeting. The bomb went off, but Hitler survived. The plot failed, and the punishment was swift and brutal. Dozens of generals, including some who were not even involved, were arrested. Rommel was one of them. While recovering from wounds, he was given a choice: commit suicide with poison or face a public trial that would endanger his family. He chose the poison. Another high-ranking commander, Günther von Kluge, was also suspected and killed himself on his way to Berlin. The failed plot had a terrifying effect. Any idea of resisting Hitler from within the military was gone. The surviving generals were now trapped. They were forced to live a double life, publicly obeying Hitler while privately knowing it was all for nothing. They knew the regime would destroy itself and take them with it. Disobeying meant certain death, but continuing to fight meant watching Germany burn. The war was lost, and now everyone knew it, but they were powerless to stop it. But they kept fighting, out of duty and out of fear of Hitler. In December 1944, Hitler launched one last desperate attack in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. He threw his last reserves of men and tanks into the snowy Ardennes forest in Belgium, hoping to split the Allied armies. But the promised fuel never arrived, and the tanks ran out of gas. When the cloudy weather cleared, Allied planes swarmed the skies and destroyed the German columns. The offensive was a massive failure that used up Germany's last remaining forces. By February 1945, the Soviet army was on the Oder River, only about 60 kilometers from Berlin. In March, American troops captured a bridge over the Rhine River at Remagen, opening a path into the heart of Germany. General Johannes Blaskowitz reported with despair, "We are defending a bridge that leads nowhere." In Berlin, the city's final commander, General Helmuth Weidling, knew his forces were surrounded and out of ammunition. In his bunker, Hitler was still giving impossible orders. He commanded armies that didn't exist anymore to attack. He ordered old men and young boys to fight in a last-ditch militia. On April 22nd, he finally screamed that the army had failed him, but the army had nothing left. By this point, many generals were simply ignoring his orders. They surrendered their troops or tried to negotiate to save civilians from the pointless slaughter. The war was over. Everyone knew it. All that was left was to make it official. So, when did Hitler's generals truly know the war was lost? There wasn't one single day. For some, the doubt started in the snow outside Moscow in 1941, when the cold was a worse enemy than the Soviets. For many more, the moment of truth was the surrender at Stalingrad in 1943, a disaster that proved the German army could be beaten. After the failure at Kursk and the D-Day landings in 1944, there was no doubt left. So why did they keep fighting? They fought because admitting defeat was considered treason by Hitler, and treason was punished by death. They were trapped by their own loyalty, their past successes, and their fear. The tragedy is that they saw the end coming but were unable to stop it. In May 1945, after the war was finally over, General Heinrich von Vietinghoff told his British interrogator, "We lost the war in 1942. Everything after that was merely a bloody postscript." If you found this look into the slow, painful realization of defeat interesting, please hit the like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell, because history's most important lessons are worth remembering.